So, we've just spent several lectures outlining all of the vulnerabilities in the cyber domain and identifying all of the bad actors, from criminals to other nations who might want to do harm. So the question that must be pressing in your mind is whether or not the cyber realm can be made safer, and if so, how? As we will see in the next few lectures, there are a number of ways in which society is slowly bringing order to the chaos. That may not be an altogether good thing, because with order often comes control. But we begin in this lecture exploring various ways and efforts to make cyberspace a safer place. Not perfectly safe, but safer. So today, we'll start our exploration with a look at the debate in America over government regulation of cybersecurity. Many in Congress and the executive branch are calling for the government to set minimum standards for cybersecurity and to regulate the network. Others, including me, are skeptical that would be a good idea. By the end of the lecture, you'll know enough to be able to decide for yourself whether we're missing an opportunity or exercising wise restraint. Now, the first question, of course, is a basic one. Why do some people think we need any security regulation at all? After all, we don't have regulations that say require you to put bars on your windows or locks on your doors. Why do we need rules that say you have to put firewalls on your computers? The most substantial reason we might need regulation is because our national security requires it. Imagine you're General Keith Alexander, who's the commander of U.S. Cyber Command at Fort Meade in Maryland. Where do you get the electricity that runs the servers you use to do cyber defense and offensive operations? You may have many on-site backup generators, but your primary source of power is a private company, Baltimore Gas and Electric. Now, if Baltimore Gas and Electric goes down for a week because of a cyber attack, that would be a great hardship for the citizens of Baltimore and the surrounding suburbs. But for Cyber Command and the National Security Agency, which is also located at Fort Meade, that would be a significant national security concern. And of course, the problem is not limited to BG&E and Cyber Command. Across the board, our military response is critically dependent on cyber capabilities for transportation, for communication, and for power. So, some see the lack of private sector cyber protection as a problem that threatens our very national existence. Indeed, as Michael Chertoff, the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, explained in testimony that he gave to Congress in February 2012, quote, "Left to their own devices, few private companies would invest more in securing their cyber assets than the actual value of those assets. Yet, in an interconnected and interdependent world, the failure of one part of the network can have devastating collateral and cascading effects across a wide range of physical, economic, and social systems. Thus, the marketplace is likely to fail in allocating the correct amount of investment to manage risk across the breadth of the networks on which our society relies." In October 2012, when he spoke about the topic, U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta echoed that sentiment, saying that America was facing an imminent cyber Pearl Harbor. That, in a nutshell, is why some U.S. senators were so anxious to pass a bill regulating network cybersecurity, and why President Obama wanted to issue an executive order for cybersecurity. So what are we to make of this argument? It certainly seems persuasive. If the threat of a cyber Pearl Harbor is real, who would not want to take any step, including regulation, to prevent it? After all, if the threat of economic disruption on a grand enough scale is real, then the U.S. government would be disabled from responding to external threats, or at least severely dissuaded. For example, if China gets into a conflict with Taiwan, then the U.S. might be prevented from intervening militarily by virtue of the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure. Or alternatively, the NSA might be preemptively disabled by a takedown of the BG&E electric grid. Note, though, that this entire line of thought equates vulnerability with risk. And yes, vulnerabilities exist, even for catastrophic critical infrastructure attacks. And the consequence of such an attack would be severe. But vulnerability isn't risk. You have to find someone who actually wants to implement a threat and has the capability to do so. Right now, there aren't a lot of someones out there. Just reflect for a moment on what it took to make the Stuxnet virus operational. According to public reports, which I hasten to add are the only basis for my knowledge, the creators of Stuxnet had a detailed insider's knowledge of the way in which the Siemens controllers worked. This suggests either active assistance from the company or a significant intrusion there in the first instance. That knowledge was not, however, enough. A broad-scale cyber espionage program, active over the course of several years, known as FLAME, was also required to closely map the Iranian cyber systems to discover the precise contours of the vulnerabilities to be exploited. Mock-ups of the centrifuge system had to be built, using, allegedly, centrifuges received from Libya, back when Libya was trying to be nice to the West, and then tests run to prove the viability of the virus. 4 separate zero-day exploits had to be identified and incorporated, a wildly profligate use of 0 days. And once the program was ready, then some type of espionage, a human agent, social engineering, where someone was tricked into putting the malware on through, say, a spear phishing attack. Some of that was necessary to get the virus inside the Iranian system. Plus, of course, someone had to have the cyber Jedi skills to write the code in the first place. This is most assuredly not the stuff of a small-scale hacker group or terrorist cell. It's the product of a nation-state. So, do we really think China's going to do that to us when we can do it to them in return? I don't mean to sound overly sanguine about the prospect of a catastrophic cyber intrusion on critical infrastructure. Clearly, the vulnerabilities do exist. Indeed, in 2007, the U.S. National Research Council said that high-level threats from sophisticated adversaries could result in a digital Pearl Harbor that would require a very quick and active response from our IT vendors and users. But what is striking, at least to me, is that this prediction was made in 2007, which is almost 3 generations ago in terms of cyber processing power. And yet, nothing that bad has happened. And the first person to speak about a cyber Pearl Harbor that I'm aware of was the Clinton-era director of the CIA, John Deutsch, back in 1996. That's an awful long time to be on the hook for Pearl Harbor. Of course, we must be painfully aware of all of the people who've gone wrong in predicting technological developments. The folks who said planes would never fly, or that battleships would never be sunk by airplanes. And the equally dismal record of those predicting future political developments, including the prediction that the Soviet Union would never fall. But we can only work with what we have in front of us, and the bottom line on the cyber threat is this. In my judgment, today, right now, the only actors capable of even thinking about a large-scale, crippling cyber assault are other nation-states. The likelihood that they will do so is roughly the same as the chances of a large-scale kinetic war, meaning a war with guns, bombs, planes, and the like. If you think we're going to get into a shooting war with China anytime soon, then by all means, be afraid of a cyber war. But if you think that the chance of a kinetic conflict with nation-state peers is slim, then I think so too is the chance of a cyber war. And for now, today, the chaotic actors who we might fear more, like anonymous or terrorists, well, they just don't have these capabilities. They are likely to get them sometime in the future, but exactly when they will is deeply and radically uncertain. It won't be tomorrow. It may not be for 5 years. and it might not be for 20. And so, without a better case for critical infrastructure catastrophe as a realistic possibility and not just a theoretical vulnerability, some are not persuaded that a cyber regulatory system is needed. Now, there are also other reasons to think regulation might be necessary, more traditional ones relating to market failures and economics. To understand this part of the problem, let me start with a short game. You don't need anything to play except your brain. It's actually a multi-part game, so here's the first part. I want you to think in your mind about everything you personally do in cyberspace. Think about how you use the internet to collect information, how you Google, how your iPhone tells you where the nearest Starbucks is. Think about how you use cyberspace to communicate, all the emails you send and the video conferences you may do using Skype. Think of how you post your status on Facebook and upload your pictures to Flickr. Now think about the commerce that you do on the internet, the books you buy from Amazon, the shoes you get from Zappos. And now we add in some of the other stuff you do, the political campaigns that you work on, the hobbies you talk about, the news you get, and the doctors you consult. And if you're on the cutting edge and have, say, one of those wired homes, think about those uses, like the ability to turn on the heat from a distance before you get home. Think of all those things that you do in cyberspace. And now imagine giving it all up. How much money would it take today, right now, right here, cash on the barrelhead, for me to convince you to completely give up cyberspace? This is for real. This is not give it up a little and get the information from your wife or your brother or your friend. This is really and truly give it up completely. If you want to make a phone call, use a landline phone. If you want to buy a book, you have to go to a brick and mortar bookstore, assuming you can find one today. To buy theater tickets, you actually have to go to the movie theater. So, how much money would it take? What would you take? Would you accept $1 million? How about $5 million? Now, I often ask this question of students, and the average amount that seems to be something like $2 million. Now, your value may be more or less. The lowest I ever heard was $500,000, and the highest was a pure refusal for any amount. But let's use $2 million as our number. And now let's assume you're 40 years old and that you're going to live until you're 90, so for another 50 years. That makes the math easy for me. And that gives us an annualized value of $40,000 a year. That's what economists would say is your utility valuation of internet access. So now here's the second part of the question. How much do you spend annually to get that access? If you're like me, you spend maybe $50 a month for your DSL line. That's the American average, or $600 a year. Add in maybe another $1,000 a year for your cell phone. Talk about the value proposition of cyberspace. You spend $1,600 a year for something that you value at $40,000. That's pretty good, right? And now the next question, the third part. How much do you spend protecting that investment? Maybe you have a firewall system that costs you $40 a year, if that. So in some way, you personally think that your chances of being subject to an intrusion are less than 1 in 1,000 each year, $40 over 40,000. By now, in this series of lectures, you've probably figured out that you're kidding yourself. And now the closing part. Let's change the perspective from you personally to all the public and private corporations and entities in our lives. Consider all the things that they do in cyberspace from a business perspective. They keep records of government activity, they communicate with their constituents, they keep track of projects, schedule meetings, hold on to the personal data of their taxpayers or customers, they follow the markets, and their engineers use it to operate the wastewater treatment plant. School principals send out letters to parents and post grades, Zappos sends shoes, and Amazon sends you books, while Walmart tracks all of its thousands of products. If they were forced to do without the internet, the engineers would have to be affiliated, and taxes would have to be assessed by leaders would records, books, bookstores, and rates would skyrocket. Yet businesses also systematically invest in internet security. Why is that? Because at least in the short term, money, they don't need to take the cost of that underinvestment into account. It's what becomes an externality. That can give harm. In other words, something I do privately of you. For example, I have a dog in my house. His barking may protect me, but if it disrupts your sleep, that's an externality. These extra effects can be negative if my dog keeps you from sleeping, or positive if it protects you from burglars. Many cybersecurity tips have positive effects. By securing my own server or laptop's intrusion, I benefit from the network, since it made it hard for my computer to be hijacked into a botnet and used to attack other people. Indeed, almost every security professional any cybersecurity improves the overall cybersecurity of it. But cybersecurity also has negative external effects in at least two ways. The first is what we call a diversion effect. Most methods of protections, like firewalls, have the effect of diverting attacks from one target to another. Any improvement in one actor's security is equivalent to a decrease in security for systems that are not as well protected. So if I have a really good intrusion detection system and you don't, guess who the hackers go after? The second negative effect is a pricing problem that risks the failure of the private market. Sometimes the price of a product doesn't have all the costs of the product built in. A classic example is air pollution, where the long-term costs from adding carbon to the atmosphere aren't part of the cost of the car or of the gasoline used to drive it. When costs like that aren't included in the price of a product, the product is, in some sense, too cheap, and somebody else winds up paying the costs in the end. The costs of cybersecurity failures are just like that. When software fails to prevent an intrusion, or when a service provider fails to stop a malware attack, Microsoft and Verizon, they don't bear the expense of fixing the problem. Instead, the end user, who owns the computer, pays the cost to clean his machine or recover his stolen identity. In general, and there are a few exceptions, no mechanism currently exists by which the software manufacturer or the internet service provider can be made responsible for the costs of those failures. In this way, security of the broader system of the entire internet is a classic market externality, whose true costs are not adequately recognized in the prices charged and the costs experienced by individual actors. And that's why some people think regulation is necessary. If the market isn't functioning, then they say it needs to be fixed. So let's say you're persuaded that regulation is necessary, either for national security reasons or for reasons of economics. Just how would that work? Who might be regulated? And who would set the standards? And how much would compliance cost? Of course, the devil is in the details, and there are many, many possible variations. So let's make some middle-of-the-road assumptions and see what effects they would have. Who's covered? Well, as you might guess from our discussion so far, the basic idea is that any new regulatory system would cover only cyber infrastructure that's connected to physical systems where damage to the physical system would have a major impact. For example, causing a catastrophic interruption of life-sustaining services, catastrophic economic damage, or a severe degradation of our national security capabilities. There's no value in requiring small and unimportant systems to comply with an expensive federal requirement. So how will we know which systems are the important ones? Well, one model would be to ask the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to decide. She would determine which sectors, like, say, the electric grid, are critical, and which, say, perhaps the financial sector, have already taken significant steps to counter an attack. Others, like the agriculture sector, they might not be vulnerable because they don't depend on cyber systems that much. After that, the Secretary might decide which are the most critical systems within a particular sector. Nobody knows how to do that right now. We can't say, for example, exactly which electrical systems are the most important. We might guess that larger electrical grids will be more critical than smaller ones based on the size of the population they serve, but perhaps some small system might support a vital industry or a critical switching station. So we'd have to do an analysis and make some decisions. And of course, to be fair, owners would have to be able to challenge their designation as critical through a civil action in court if they wished. So what would this mean? Well, one thing is clear. As James Lewis of the Center for Strategic and International Studies has noted, the entire enterprise of creating a protected list, by definition, creates an unprotected list of systems that might be less secure. This is, quote, a bit like writing a targeting list for our opponents, close quote. I don't know how you avoid that problem unless you expand this regulatory structure to cover all cyber systems in America. But the reality is we can't protect all systems all the time. Still, once we know what to protect, we'll have to face the question of how to decide how to protect it. One way might be for the federal government to set protection standards directly. Almost nobody thinks that's a good idea. The government is too slow in writing rules and not nearly as innovative in developing defenses as the private sector is. So a better way would be to set up a regulatory structure that's based on performance standards instead of regulatory mandates. What's the difference between the two? Well, under performance standards, you're given a goal to achieve. Say, prevent 95% of cyber attacks, and then you're left to your own devices to achieve it. In a regulatory structure, the government tells you what to do exactly. For example, install a firewall, because that is how it thinks you should achieve the objective. To establish performance standards, the government would have to consult with the private sector to learn about performance requirements that they've already developed. Once that review of practices, regulations, and performance requirements is completed, we would have to decide whether or not the existing rules are adequate. If they're not, then someone would have to develop sector-specific, risk-based cybersecurity performance requirements for the owners of the covered critical infrastructure. In other words, the standards for the electric grid might be different than those for, say, the transportation network. By and large, this system of guidance and standards, rather than regulatory direction, makes real sense. As Stuart Baker, former Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security, said in February 2012, quote, "This broad structure is meant to solve the problem of how to regulate a fast-moving and complex technology. It does so by leaving as much discretion as possible in the hands of the private sector. This doesn't call for government simply to tell industry what security technologies to adopt. The point of the process is to identify the risks, warn industry of those risks, and challenge industry to develop standards and adopt measures that industry finds best adapted to the risks." So all that seems quite reasonable and even plausible. So what's not to like about this proposal? Here's what some of the critics say. First, and wholly apart from questions about whether the performance requirements will be any good, the main criticism has been that implementing them will simply cost too much. That's what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce thinks. The truth, I think, is that nobody has any real idea. The problem with performance standards as an approach, which otherwise is far superior to the command and control system of rules, is that the legislation is really just an agreement to agree, a command to begin a process that identifies standards of cybersecurity protection. Nobody knows what those standards might be in the end. And until standards are defined, nobody really knows how owners will achieve them. And nobody can reasonably predict what the costs of compliance will be. They may be cheap and easy if all it takes, for example, is systems that's from the internet. Or expensive as heck if the only way to achieve compliance is to deploy a suite of hyper-sophisticated, costly intrusion detection and prevention systems. Given this uncertainty, in the end, the commitment to a performance standard is a bit like going out on a blind date. You know you're in the game, but you can't be sure it's going to turn out. Another significant criticism is that the regulatory process is slow. If we're going to have a process, how is that process going to play out? And how long will it take? Federal rulemaking is very long and cumbersome. We don't have time here to talk about the details of the process, but the bottom line is that any new cybersecurity measure might not be in place until 8 to 10 years after enactment of a law. Now, that's the worst-case scenario, but even at its fastest pace, significant government regulatory initiatives like this one would take at least 2 to 3 years. Now, realize that processing speed for computers doubles every 18 to 24 months. That means that the regulatory process in America is too slow for the cyber environment. Critics say that the standards we develop are guaranteed to be at least 1 or 2 computer generations behind, out of date before they're even published. And while we're waiting for the standards to be developed, innovators and investors would be frozen. Now, because nobody wants to invest in a product that the government might reject as inadequate, if you take this view of the regulatory timeline, well, then the game just isn't worth the candle. Finally, some technologists say that the standards would just be ineffective. The ultra-sophisticated cyber attacks that could disable critical infrastructure are not going to be stopped by the adoption of best practices and standards, they say. These attacks are non-standard attacks that overcome defenses like intrusion detection, firewalls, and passwords. So, according to the technologists, the regulatory solutions we're proposing won't solve the gravest problems we're actually trying to address. I'll give the final word in this debate to Jack Goldsmith, a professor at Harvard University. He makes the case for regulation in the following terms. Quote, cybersecurity is an enormous challenge because most of the targets and the channels of the attack are owned by the private sector. And we do not trust government regulation of the private sector, especially in the technology and communications context. But the government is the only institution with the resources and the incentives to ensure that the critical infrastructure on which we all depend is secure. And we must find a way for it to meet its responsibilities. Any particular proposal might not be ideal, but the issue should be how to improve the proposal, not whether the government should have a serious role in ensuring that the private sector adequately protects critical infrastructure. To this, one can only add a final question. If not government regulation, then what? The externalities of cybersecurity are altogether too real. If we don't want government involved, how do we fix them? There are any number of possibilities, but let's end with one novel idea, to turn Shakespeare on his head. And first thing we do, let's send in the lawyers. Here's what I mean. Right now, today, there is no liability rule for cybersecurity failures. As we discussed, when you buy a Microsoft software product or a Cisco router or any other commercial IT product, you sign away your right to sue for failures. As a result, Microsoft is not legally responsible if there are bugs in the code. What if we're not? Some think that's just what we need. They argue that liability would make IT providers more careful. They would have to exercise a reasonable degree of care in writing code or making their products, or be subject to suit. They buy insurance to pay for damages if the suits were successful. And the insurers would, in turn, require the IT providers to meet certain standards before they were insured. That's how liability works in a host of commercial industries today, ranging from cars to ladders. So why not software and hardware systems? Of course, this would be a big change. It might stifle innovation, for example. Fearful of lawsuits, cyber companies would be cautious, and development could slow to a crawl. And for consumers, it might mean significantly higher prices, as we pay the real costs for better cybersecurity. In any event, thinking more deeply about this type of proposal requires a great deal more time than we have today, I'm afraid. But I offer it as a thought experiment for you to consider. Well, there you have it. Both sides of the regulatory debate. And it's a terribly vital question. If you value security, we need government regulation. But it will clearly come at the cost of increasing government control of the network, a cost that I personally think is too high. But what do you think? Is the government the only entity we can trust to spend enough money on cybersecurity? Or will government regulation just mess up a good thing? In our next lecture, we will look at another possible source of rules and regulations, this time the international community. International regulation will look very different from the domestic U.S. regulatory system and it poses a different set of questions. But it might be just as effective, or maybe ineffective, as the US system of cybersecurity. We'll think about that next time. Until then, thanks for joining me.